Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Go Big Live Real Estate Investors Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Drouin. I have special guest today, Mr. Jonathan Nichols. It's Jonathan, right? Or John?
That's Jonathan. You're good.
So after almost 10 years in the aerospace engineering industry, now aerospace is like a humble way of saying this guy's a rocket scientist. I want to talk a little bit about that. Jonathan made the transition to investing with his wife, Paula, in 2018. With a passion for helping others achieve their goals and a high work ethic, Jonathan has already made a significant impact in the world of real estate. During this episode, Jonathan will share his journey, challenges, and strategies for success in the commercial multifamily space. Jonathan's expertise will inspire and guide you on your own investment. Thanks for being on the show, Jonathan.
Hey, Matt, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I like to start the show with the same question with everybody. You were born and now you're here. What happened in between?
Wow. I'll try not to be too long-winded. I grew up here in south part of the United States. I was born in Oklahoma, but grew up in Texas. And so consider myself a Texan. And so I went to school at Texas A&M, studied engineering there, as you've mentioned, and met my wife, Paula, there. And thought I would have a pretty normal engineering career, graduated school, got a job, started working. And shortly after I got married to my wife, she informed me one day that we needed to have a hobby together. And I had no idea of what that could be. I'm not really the golf type or anything like that. So I was a little unsure of what would work for us. And then shortly after that, I was reading a book that probably many of your listeners have read, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And that's what kind of sparked the interest in real estate investing for me. And so I told her, I said, hey, what about this idea of, doing real estate investing as a hobby, but instead of a hobby that takes money, maybe it'll make money for us. And so she was totally on board and we jumped in, started learning, listened to every Bigger Pockets podcast they had at the time, et cetera, et cetera. And shortly thereafter made our first investment. We house hacked a fourplex. That's going back several years ago and just grew from there. Just started buying properties any way we could find. Built up a portfolio of short-term rentals that we have here in Arlington, Texas. Did that for a couple of years. It was successful. And then set our sights on bigger goals. And so we talked to a lot of investors who were full-time investors and said, hey, what is it that you do that allows you to be full-time in real estate? And the overwhelming response is we invest in multifamily, specifically with syndications. And so we began to learn about that, eventually started a business doing that. Started doing some projects and fast forward, here we are today. We both work full time in our business, Apogee, and the rest is history.
Wow, awesome. You know what? I need to get Paula on for a part two and get her side of the story, because what an amazing person to suggest that and be all on board with real estate being a hobby. And that's awesome. You guys get to work together day to day. Just a sidebar. How does that work out? How do you work as a team together?
It's funny. Everyone asks that question. And for us, I would say it's pretty organic because we started this together, right? It really was started out as a hobby. We enjoy doing it together. But I think since starting, we've learned we both have our own skill sets. If you're familiar with like the entrepreneur operating system and all that, like I'm more of a visionary. I see more kind of the big picture stuff, but I am very analytical because of the engineering background. So I like analyzing deals, talking to brokers, getting deals through the acquisition phase, talking to investors, whereas she tends to be extremely structured, extremely process driven, which lends itself to doing well at asset management, to setting up some of the business systems and keeping those going. And so we each have our own defined swim lane, and we'll jump into each other's swim lane every now and then, but with the understanding that the other person's in charge of that. And so I think that really keeps things organized for us.
100%. Jonathan, what was like the seminal moment when you decided to go big, and what did that look like?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it was any one moment per se, because when we started out, we really did think of this as a hobby. And then we realized, hey, with investing, it almost can't be a hobby, right? If you want to be successful, it's so competitive that you have to take it seriously. And that's true whether you're doing syndication or house flipping or long-term buy and hold type stuff, right? You have to take it seriously if you want to be successful. And so it was, hey, if we're going to put this much effort in, might as well be our full-time gig. So I think it was just a process. And most of it, I would say the first very little part of it revolved around us realizing, hey, this is something we would want to do full-time as opposed to our careers that we already had established. But then a lot of it was just believing and recognizing, hey, we can do this full-time. And so I think once that sort of clicked, then it was no looking back.
Yeah, let's go in and dissect your first big deal, or that was big to you at the time when you started jumping into the multifamily space, and what that looked like in terms of the story and the origin of that deal.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll talk about the first syndication deal we did, large multifamily deal that we did, where we were the lead sponsor syndicating it, meaning we found the deal, we ran it to ground and pulled in some other people to help us with it, but we were the ones in charge, so to speak. And so it's a 75 unit property in College Station, Texas. For any of your listeners that aren't familiar, if you draw a triangle between Dallas, Houston, and Austin, College Station is the city right in the center of that. About 250,000 MSA, and it's where A&M's located. That's where we both went to school. So we're very familiar with it. It's a growing metropolitan area like you would want to see in any area you're investing in. And so I had a broker who brought me this deal off market. And what's interesting is that at first glance, I actually turned him down on it. I said, hey, we're not really interested. And the reason was it was a 2012 build, beautiful, like townhome style building. And it didn't need renovation or anything. There was, in my mind, no value add on the project. And so I just assumed, hey, it's not going to give the returns that we're looking for. But the broker, thank goodness, came back to me and said, hey, you need to dive into this a little bit because this deal is a steal. And so what it wound up being is it was owned by a mom and pop who self-managed the property. And when I say self-manage, they do everything, like the leasing, the maintenance, whole 9 yards. And so their primary goal had been to keep the property kind of low drama, if you will, and 100% occupied all the time. And so when I started doing my market research, I realized that the units were at least $100 below market rent because they just hadn't been pushing in a market that rents were increasing pretty rapidly in. And so we didn't need a big CapEx project to have a value add component to this property. And so we purchased the property, put it in a professional third-party manager local to that area. And we pushed rents. I think it was like $120 average per unit year one. And then second year, about $50 unit average, and still continuing to go from there. And so it's been a huge win, not just in the sense of the returns, but I would say with the risk profile, because there's no construction risk. There's no, can we execute on this CapEx, or we're hoping that our units rent for the same amount as this other property down the street. It's just, they are what they are. And we're bringing value to tenants by professionally managing the property. That's been a huge win. Happy to jump into any piece of it that you want, but that's the overarching story.
Excellent, Jonathan. So a broker brought this deal to you off market before they went through the typical marketing channels like LoopNet and Crexy and that sort of thing. What put you in the position to have this broker bring that deal to you?
It's interesting. I just finished reading this book. It's actually still sitting here on my desk. It's called Multifamily Investors Who Dominate. I had not heard of it before, but I just bought it. And I think the book kind of answers this question of like, how do you as an investor get access to quality off-market deals before anyone else does? And the short answer is that it's all about relationships, right? So there are some deals, and I would in fact say many deals, that the seller of that deal wants to fully market the property, and their primary objective is to get the top dollar they could possibly get. That is the bucket that most owners or sellers, if you will, fall into. However, I think there are other buckets of sellers that have specific needs in terms of wanting an easy closing or looking for other sorts of specifics within the contract. Is this owner that we purchased from, he and his wife, they were looking for a hassle-free buyer, a buyer who just went in, did what they said they're going to do, closed, got the money that they wanted out of it, but not necessarily the top dollar. And we're going to take care of the property. They actually own other properties in this market. And so now we're fellow owners, if you will, in that market. And they want to keep the reputation and stuff up of it, I think. And so this broker I had been speaking with for a long time. This was not the first project we looked at together. And I think a lot of it was just consistency, looking at deals. He'd send something to me and I'd analyze it, give him feedback as quickly as possible. And then him just recognizing, hey, this feedback's actually accurate. This makes sense coming from a buyer, that it's valued at this, or I see where Jonathan's going with this. And having conversations with him I think over time that builds the trust necessary to where they not only like you, but they trust that, hey, you're going to do what you say and you're level headed. And it's really all about relationship building with the brokers, in my opinion.
So what was the origin of that first conversation with that broker? Was this somebody that, hey, they had a multifamily property on LoopNet that you called them on? Tell me about that.
Yeah, it could be. So I definitely, when I started out as an investor, I met a lot of the brokers that I initially developed relationships with through looking at properties on LoopNet or even just on different websites where they were fully marketed for their brokerage. I don't remember my first conversation with this particular broker, but I suspect it had origins in some sort of story like that. And usually when I look at it, I'll talk to him, and I always recommend that newer investors take the time to look at some on-market deals with brokers, because that's a good way to get the broker's attention without wasting their time, because you're actually looking at a project that they're interested in, that they're working on. Mm-hmm. And it's an opportunity to showcase your expertise, right? Of, hey, I'm looking at this. I have these questions. This is my process for reviewing this. And after you've done that a few times, they start to get the sense, okay, Jonathan knows what he's doing. He can get this deal closed. And then being very clear on your criteria. So I think in addition to that level of trust, one reason that we got this property specifically is that he happened to know that both me and my wife were Aggies, that we went to school at A&M. And he actually lives a long ways away from this market. And so for him, it was like, who knows this market that I can refer this deal to? And so it wasn't even a market that we were necessarily like actively pursuing deals in, even though it's a good market. It's just our ties to it helped us to come up first in the thought process as he was thinking of potential buyers.
Excellent. So was there an asking price on this deal or not?
There was. And we don't ever say in Texas, because we don't like to disclose the price, but it was just say X dollars. And I think I'm going to make this up. I think we were in maybe 100,000 below asking price, 200,000 or something. This 75 unit deal. So that's not a whole lot on a deal like that, a few percent. And he's, hey, actually, I think you may be more on target. I think they're asking a little high and they may be willing to work with you. And so it actually came down to best and final, because there were other buyers that looked at it. Between us and one other buyer, the other buyer lived in California. And so it was like, hey, you guys are both like neck and neck with the same price. You both are offering hard money day one. You both have good reputations. What is it that's going to differentiate you? And so for me, it was like, hey, we live 3 hours away. We know the market way better than they know it. I don't care how many reports and data sets they've looked at. I lived there for years. Like, I know the market extremely well. Actually lived right around the corner from the property kind of thing. And we would love to own there. And then the other thing we did is we went and visited the property with the actual owner. So I already mentioned the broker lived a long ways away.
Yeah.
And so you'll almost never see this on a deal. It was very unique, but the broker was like, hey, just go meet with the owner and tour the deal with him. And so my wife and I went down there. We met with him and his wife, had lunch with them, hung out, looked at the property. And so that made them very comfortable with us as buyers. And maybe if the other buyers had flown in and done the same thing, they would have been able to develop the same rapport. But because they didn't, I think that's what ultimately allowed us to be awarded the contract.
That's an awesome story. There's so many things to learn from that in terms of how you can differentiate yourself from another buyer, especially with those mom and pops. I know that a lot of times people think that commercial real estate is this like completely unemotional, data-driven type of thing, but there are emotions involved with it. I know that I confess there's some properties I own I'm like emotionally attached to. I have relationships with the tenants because they're commercial tenants that was their first place of business and all that stuff. There are definitely different other motivating factors, and also the fact that you were more local, I think led to you being able to prevail. So you mentioned money hard day one. For those listeners that aren't familiar with that, tell us about that. And is that what you do going forward, or was this just was necessary to take the deal down?
Yeah, I was living in Texas. So this was 2021 era when we were doing our first deals, lead sponsors. And anyone that knows the market then, if you didn't have hard money day one in Texas as a market, you weren't doing deals. Like there was no way around it. There was no contingencies, nothing. You just had to know what you're doing, which to me was pretty frightening when I think about C-class type properties that can have all kinds of pitfalls and deferred maintenance and roof issues, sewer line issues, et cetera. But when you're talking about something that at this time was 9 years old, that greatly reduces your risk. Okay. And I think also having an owner that was very understanding and not necessarily trying to hide anything about the property also made us feel really comfortable. The owner was willing to take us around the property, show us some of the issues he'd had, discuss some different things about it. So that's why I felt comfortable doing it. But it's a risky proposition, right? As a general partner in a deal, it's something that you have to decide, is it worth it or not? And I would say a lot of my C or even B deals, we're putting in contingencies in our contracts and our LOIs. I don't get the deal because of that. That's just our level of acceptable risk. But a lot of times, I think sellers just want to know you're not going to back out because of something wishy-washy, right? It's not because you didn't do your analysis or you're not prepared or you can't raise the money or whatever. They just want to know that, hey, whatever you say you're going to do within reason, you're going to do it. And so we try to make our LOIs reflect that sort of mentality where something's really bad, really wrong with the property, we have a way out. But if there's not, we're going to execute and do what we've promised. So that's the short of it in a nutshell.
Okay. So tell us about the capital stack with this deal. How much debt did you have to bring in? How much equity did it bring in? Tell us about that. Without disclosure.
We brought in, here is one of the challenges. I'll share one of the challenges with the deals I described. We had a CMBS lender, which a lot of multifamily owners probably have never used before. Very common in self-storage or like single family portfolio type investments, not as much in multifamily. And the reason we used them was because they offered great terms, because this property, since it's near a university, it's not student housing, but it did have a large number of students within the population of the property. And so we rent by the unit, 12-month leases, just like any normal multifamily property. But there were a certain percentage of students that had cosigners on their leases. And so the agency lenders, they start to frown on that if it's over about 40%. And this property was about 60% at that time. And so we couldn't really get good terms, if any terms, from the agency lenders. We had a couple banks that offered us some pretty good terms, but obviously those were recourse. And so ultimately decided to go with the CMBS lender, which had great terms. They did exactly what they said they were going to do, but from a legal and kind of org structure perspective was extremely difficult to execute on. But they gave us essentially 75% loan to value. This is fixed rate debt. I love fixed rate debt. And right now, it's especially a good time to talk about that. Fixed rate debts, low risk, non-recourse. And then the rest was limited partners that we brought into the deal. So nothing fancy, no preferred equity. This was a 80-20 split deal between limited partners and ourselves with a 6% preferred return. The 5-year hold was the planned hold period. I actually think we'll sell and hit our equity multiple a couple of years before that, but we'll see. So anyways, that's it in short. But part of our business plan then, because we had such a hard time with the lending, is we're slowly but surely reducing that population of students that has cosigners and looking more for grad students or young professionals that work in the community or on the campus. And I think we're very close to being below that 40% threshold, so that when we go to sell, our buyer will be able to get very lucrative agency financing and then therefore pay us a lot more for the property. So
that is so awesome. This is like a little bit of a tactical trick, right? This is something that could even be a value add type of strategy that a syndicator could use, is locating properties that are quote unquote student housing. The development company that I worked for before, we acquired a property that had a high population of students with cosigners, and we converted it over to market rate apartment to reduce that threshold. And we not only were able to reduce the insurance big time on the property, but also have it qualify for more advantageous agency debt, and really exploded the asset value on that. That's a really great strategy for that property, in my opinion.
Yeah, the story's not over yet, but it seems that way. So we're excited about it.
Yeah. So let's talk about the capital raise. Was this more capital than you had to raise in your entire life?
It was. We brought on co-GP partners to help us with the raise. The raise was challenging. It took some work to get it done, but I think we completed it maybe 2 or 3 weeks before closing. It didn't delay closing or anything. We did raise quite a bit. I think Paul and I raised a little over $1.5 million for that deal, which was definitely the biggest raise that we've done so far. And then we had a handful of other partners that finished off the last bit of the raise. We'll call it a 30 to 40% of the rest of the equity needed. I think a lot of the key is just having potential co-general partners that you can pull onto deals that have aligned interests in terms of the deals they're looking for, the structure of the deal, et cetera, and that are ready to go, ready to work with you. Because truthfully, as a lead sponsor, your job is not necessarily to raise all the money or even a majority of the money. It's just to have the team that can do it. That was our approach to it.
Where did those relationships come from? Because there was some capital partners, limited partners that were relationships that you and Paula had, right? So how did you put yourself in a position leading up to that ask?
You mean from a perspective of relationships with our co-GPs or with our limited partners that are on the deal?
With your limited partners? Because I'm familiar for those of you listening that aren't familiar, if you're in a position as a lead sponsor and you're maybe, let's say, short on a capital raise, or maybe capital raising it just isn't one of your things, but you have a good deal, you can bring on a co-general partner. They would own a piece of the GP and they would bring in LP investors. Am I characterizing that right?
No, yeah, absolutely. That sounds right. I think for us, so first of all, this was our first deal as lead sponsors. We had been co-GPs on another deal several months, or not several months, more like 6 or 8 months prior to this one. That was like our first big syndication project. And we were not, and this is always a sticking point people talk about, we were not just co-GPs that just raised a little bit of money and, we're in a deal, right? We were active partners. So I actually did the due diligence, walk on the property, helped with the underwriting, signed on the loan, put down risk money. Like I was a very active general partner on the deal, still am. And a lot of times I think people are like, just get the first deal done and raise $250,000 and then like I'm set for life with multifamily. And the truth is, it really depends, what do you get out of that first deal? And so for me, even though I was a co-GP on it, I got as much out of it as I could. I learned what I needed to from an experience standpoint to be able to execute. And all that's tied back that our limited partners, several of them reinvested with us because they had already been on that first deal. By that time, we had already given, or were about to give, our first distribution on that deal. So the business plan, what you could see in the short time frame, was on track. But then I think even bigger picture than that, we were very intentional about priming the pipe, so to speak, with investors and knowing where we were from an investor standpoint. We made an effort to talk to anyone in our network, whether it be friends, family, professional contacts, explain what we were doing. Fortunately, we already had 3 years of real estate investing. Even though it was our own money in our own deals, we had investing experience that we could leverage to say, hey, we've done these 6 other projects and they've all been very successful. And we think that will lend itself to us being successful on these type of projects. And so all that really helped us out a lot. And then I think a lot of it's listening to your investors, putting their interests first. Like I said, we offer, so far every deal we've done, we offer a preferred return, which is something that some syndicators do and some don't. I really think we could be successful raising either way, but it just makes me feel better saying, hey, you as the limited partner, we're putting you first. And so I think that they really appreciate that. Yeah, I think beyond that, it's just making sure the investors that you have are comfortable with the type of deal that you're pursuing so that when the time comes to sign and wire, they're ready to do.
So how did that conversation start? Because you're Jonathan Nichols, the rocket scientist, and now you're Jonathan Nichols, the real estate syndicator. That sort of changing identity and being seen in a different way with people that are in your network and in your sphere of influence. Tell me about how those conversations first started. Was this sort of like a one-to-one type of thing, getting caught up with people that were former colleagues and friends and family, telling them about what you're doing? And just tell me about that a little bit.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I think one thing is that it's almost impossible to have 2 identities, right? And so if you're going to change, you have to actually change, and it will take time. But let me give you a silly but meaningful example. In the professional world, a lot of us have a LinkedIn profile. And so for years, my LinkedIn profile was Jonathan Nichols, aerospace engineer, working propulsion analysis. And this is the kind of projects I've done. And so when I made the decision, hey, I'm going to be a full-time multifamily investor, I went to my LinkedIn profile and I left my background on there. I want people to see my professional experience and the kind of infer the skill sets that perhaps I take from previous career to this one. But who I am today is a real estate investor. And I went ahead and changed that even a year before I left my full-time employer. And I'm like, hey, maybe a boss sees it. I'm sure coworkers are going to see it, but this is who I'm going to be. If they fire me or something for it, then I just start the journey that much sooner. It's just being not one foot on each side of the fence all the way in. Definitely a big thing if you want to change your identity, so to speak. And then just being intentional and talking to people about it. I don't know if I mentioned, but when Paula and I started in multifamily specifically, we joined a mentorship group. That was Michael Blanc that you mentioned, because we felt like even though we had real estate experience, having a mentor looking over our shoulder, our first couple of deals, was something that was going to give us a lot of peace of mind since we were using other people's money in those deals. And now we've gone full circle, and she and I are actually both coaches in his program. So we're teaching other students, and students ask me all the time, how can I talk to investors? It's super awkward. And the first thing I tell them is have as many organic conversations with people as possible. And so you go into work on Monday, and what's the first thing all your coworkers ask you? What did you do this weekend? And if you're a typical American, the answer is one of three things: nothing, ran my kids around to activities, or watched the game, whatever the game is, football, baseball, whatever. That's literally probably 70% of the time, one of the three answers you're going to get. And so I said, never say that again. That's what I tell them. Don't ever say that again. It's, hey, I did work on my real estate business this weekend. That's such an odd answer. It's very, no one's going to care that you answer that, but it's so odd. 99% of the time, someone is always going to ask a follow-up question about it, right? Tell me about that. What is that? How did you get started? Or if they already know that you do it, what did you do this weekend? Do you have any crazy stories to tell? And so I would submit that there's actually a lot of different situations like that where you can have very organic conversations. The kicker is that for you to be able to do that across your entire network, you need some time. So you can't just start raising money 2 weeks before a deal pops up that you want to raise for. Ideally, I think you need to start 6 months to a year before you're ready to actually raise for a deal, to really get people's minds turning and see who is interested and who's not. Because most people will not be interested in investing with you. That's what you have to understand. And you just got to find the people who are, and then focus your attention and your education efforts on those few.
Yeah, 100%. That's great advice. That's pretty much the show before we launch into the live Q&A with our quote unquote live studio audience that we have on Facebook and Instagram. So parting words of advice for investors looking to go big. What is that?
Yeah, I always, when people say advice, I always give the same one. It's maybe seems a little overused, but it's don't quit. Like, this industry, you get into it and you realize it's extremely challenging. One of the reasons I became an engineer is I liked the challenge. I enjoyed like pushing myself and doing more than I thought I could. And so if that fits your personality or how you like to do things, you'll do well as an investor, because there is a lot of adversity. There is a lot of challenges. It's not easy. But the people I look back on now, like the peer group, if you will, who started investing the same time I did, it's not the smartest. It's not the richest. It's not the best looking. It's the people that they just didn't give up. Like, no matter what happened, they just kept going. And those are the ones that are successful. Don't quit. And sooner or later, you will find success.
All right. I totally agree. Okay. So if you're listening to the recorded version of the podcast here and you want to get in on the live Q&A to get direct access to guests like Jonathan Nichols, hopefully Michael Blanc in the future, we've been bugging him, Gino Barbaro, Brian Burke, all these titans in real estate, make sure to join the Go Big Live Real Estate Investors Facebook group and get in on the live Q&A in our weekly episodes. Again, thanks, Jonathan. And we're going to jump into the live Q&A.